wanted to take a few minutes today to speak from my heart to the Daystar family and friends.
For years, Joni Lamb has carried a story she never fully told, the truth about Marcus's final moments. The world saw the faith, the tears, the heartbreak, but behind her calm silence was something deeper, something she couldn't bring herself to say. Now, whispers are growing louder, and questions long buried are resurfacing. What really happened in those last hours? Why did Joni stay silent for so long? The truth she's held back may change everything we thought we knew. When Marcus Lamb passed away in November 2021, it felt like the whole Christian world stopped for a moment. The headlines came fast, filled with sorrow and praise. Daystar viewers cried in their living rooms as clips of Marcus preaching replayed over soft piano music. Pastors across America posted tributes online, calling him a warrior of faith, a man who stood firm when others fell silent. Joni Lamb, his wife and co-host, appeared calm but heartbroken, her voice trembling as she thanked everyone for their prayers. To the public, it looked like a perfect picture of faith and strength in the middle of loss. But behind the bright lights and carefully edited broadcasts, there was another story quietly unfolding, one that never made it to television. Inside the Daystar offices, something felt off. Those who had worked closest to Marcus knew how hands-on he was. Nothing went on air without his approval. He was the kind of man who read every script, watched every segment, and questioned every decision. But weeks before his death, he wasn't around. Staff whispered about how long it had been since they had actually seen him. His voice still played in new broadcasts, but those were pre-recorded. His office stayed quiet, his chair empty. Some said he was resting at home. Others said he was too sick to come in. No one really knew for sure, and no one dared to ask. When the news finally broke that Marcus had died from COVID-19 complications, everyone was stunned. Or at least, that's how it looked from the outside. But for some inside the ministry, the shock wasn't as real as they thought it should be. It wasn't the loss that confused them. It was how fast everything seemed to move afterward. Within days, Joni was back in the studio, strong, composed, speaking with purpose. There were no signs of hesitation, no breaks in leadership, no pause to grieve. It was as if the machine never stopped running. The funeral came and went like a grand production, polished, beautiful, filled with speeches and songs. But once the cameras turned off, whispers began. Something about the timing didn't sit right. Marcus had always been deliberate, cautious with every step, and yet the direction of Daystar seemed to shift overnight. Projects that Marcus had postponed were suddenly moving ahead. Meetings were being held without the usual prayerful tone, and through it all, Joni stood at the center, focused and driven. People close to the ministry began asking quiet questions. Had Marcus known he was dying? Had he left instructions no one else saw? Or had someone else been planning what would happen next long before the rest of them realized it? No one accused anyone of wrongdoing, but the unease was impossible to ignore. The same halls that once echoed with Marcus's booming laugh now carried something different. Silence, tension, and the faint hum of rumors that refused to die. For the audience watching from home, it was a story of faith and resilience, but for those behind the scenes, it felt like something sacred had shifted, like they were watching the birth of a new era that Marcus himself never intended to see. The tributes played on TV, but in the corners of Daystar's studios, people were whispering, not about the man they lost, but about what might have been hidden behind the farewell. It started as a whisper, a quiet, almost unbelievable rumor that floated through the halls of Daystar like smoke. No one wanted to say it out loud at first. It felt too personal, too dangerous, too heavy. But as the weeks went on after Marcus Lamb's death, that whisper grew louder, more confident, and harder to ignore. Someone had found a diary. Not Marcus's, Joni's. The idea alone sounded unreal. Joni Lamb was the face of strength, the grieving widow who stood tall on national television and thanked viewers for their prayers. She talked about faith, about carrying on the mission, about trusting God through heartbreak. But behind that calm public image, there was said to be something much different written in those private pages. Feelings that didn't fit the picture the world had seen. No one knows exactly how the diary first surfaced. Some said a former assistant had stumbled across photocopies. Others whispered that someone close to the family quietly leaked it after growing uneasy about how fast things were changing inside the ministry. Whatever the truth, small pieces of it began circulating among a few trusted people. They didn't show the whole thing, only pages, scans, or typed out quotes, but those few sentences were enough to shake everything. The tone of the diary wasn't angry or vengeful. It was quiet, almost detached. That was what made it so disturbing to those who read it. Instead of grief or reflection, there was distance, emotional distance. Joni's words described a home filled with silence, a partnership that had lost its warmth, a husband who had become unreachable. She didn't accuse or lash out. She simply wrote about feeling unseen, unheard, and alone, beside a man who everyone else saw as a spiritual giant. One former staff member who claimed to have read a few lines said it gave them chills because it didn't sound like a woman in mourning. It sounded like someone who had already moved on in her heart. She wrote about peace, the person said. But it wasn't the peace that comes after loss. It was the kind that comes after letting go, long before the loss even happens. Then there was the entry that changed everything. The one that spread fastest, copied and shared quietly from inbox to inbox. It was dated just days before Marcus was hospitalized. It read, "Everything is coming into view now. I just have to stay quiet, let it unfold. God sees." At first glance, it seemed harmless, even spiritual, the kind of phrase that might appear in a devotional. But for those who had seen the tension in the Lamb household, who had watched Joni step into power almost seamlessly after Marcus's death, it didn't feel comforting. It felt eerie. It sounded like someone who knew something was coming and had already accepted it. That one line became the spark that set off a wave of speculation. Had Joni known Marcus's condition was worse than she told the public? Was she preparing emotionally, maybe even strategically, for a new chapter without him? Or was it all just a coincidence, a woman's private reflection taken out of context and twisted by grief? No one could say for sure, but the timing, the tone, and what followed afterward made the questions impossible to ignore. Inside Daystar, the diary became a ghost that no one could acknowledge, but everyone felt. It changed how people looked at Joni. It changed how they interpreted every decision she made after Marcus's passing. The sudden staff changes, the quick leadership restructuring, the calmness she carried through it all. Things that once seemed like strength now looked like calculation. To the public, she was steady and brave. To those inside the walls, she seemed prepared, almost too prepared. Some people defended her fiercely. They said she was simply being strong in her faith, that the diary, if real, was the private pain of a woman carrying an unbearable weight. People grieve differently, one producer said. Just because she wrote about being quiet doesn't mean she wasn't hurting. But others weren't convinced. They couldn't shake the feeling that Joni had already accepted a future without Marcus long before he was gone. What made it worse was the speed at which things changed once Marcus passed. In a matter of days, Joni was leading meetings, approving projects Marcus had delayed, and signing new agreements. There were even reports of legal documents being filed, estate changes, property transfers, leadership titles, all finalized with almost alarming precision. It was so fast, so organized, that some began to wonder if the blueprint had already been drawn before his final hospitalization. And that was when the diary took on a new meaning. To many, it wasn't just a window into Joni's thoughts. It was evidence of foreknowledge, of readiness. The words "let it unfold" suddenly sounded less like spiritual patience and more like quiet acceptance of an outcome already in motion. Joni herself never addressed it. She didn't confirm it, didn't deny it, didn't even acknowledge it existed. When journalists or former staff brought it up, the response was always the same: silence. And that silence spoke louder than any public statement could. The more she avoided the topic, the more people talked. It became the elephant in every room she entered. Some close friends claimed the pages were real. Others swore they were fabricated or manipulated. But the truth didn't matter anymore. The idea of the diary had already changed everything. It had cracked the perfect image of the Lamb marriage that millions had admired for years. It made people question the foundation of Daystar itself, whether what they had seen on screen was genuine or just performance. For years, viewers believed Marcus and Joni were unshakable, partners in faith and life, standing side by side through every trial. But the diary pulled back that curtain. It revealed a woman who, beneath the TV smiles and rehearsed prayers, was tired, distant, and maybe even ready to move on. Whether she meant those words as surrender or something else, no one could say. But once they were read, they couldn't be forgotten. Even now, no one has ever seen the full diary. only fragments, whispered quotes, partial scans passed hand to hand. But that's all it took. It didn't need to be complete to do damage. It only needed to exist. And for those who had read even a line, it changed how they remembered everything. The funeral, the broadcasts, the new relationship with Doug Weiss that followed not long after. Suddenly it all seemed to fit into a story that had been written long before the cameras ever stopped rolling. In the end, the diary wasn't just paper and ink. It became a symbol of silence, of distance, of truth kept behind closed doors. Whether it was real or rumor hardly mattered anymore. It told a story people couldn't unhear, that maybe Marcus's death wasn't the end of a chapter, but the beginning of one Joni had already prepared for. And that's why they called it the diary that changed everything. Because even if no one ever proves it existed, its shadow still lingers. In every whispered conversation, in every unanswered question, in every glance that says, something about this story doesn't add up. When Marcus Lamb passed away, the world saw a widow standing strong in her faith. Joni Lamb sat beneath the studio lights, her voice soft, her words carefully chosen, thanking the millions who had prayed for their family. She spoke about loss, about God's plan, about carrying on Marcus's mission. To viewers, it was beautiful, a picture of grace in the face of tragedy. But inside Daystar, where the cameras were off and the lights were dim, something entirely different was happening. It wasn't stillness, it wasn't mourning, it was motion, fast, focused, and shockingly organized. At first, people thought Joni was just keeping busy to distract herself from grief. That's what strong people do, right? But within days, her actions began to surprise even those closest to her. She didn't just show up to meetings, she led them. She didn't just approve projects Marcus had started, she began creating new ones. Her presence filled every corner of the ministry. The woman who had once shared the stage with Marcus now stood at the center of everything, giving orders, making calls, shifting the direction of the entire network. Longtime staff members, people who had worked beside Marcus for decades, noticed the difference immediately. Marcus had always been a leader who valued conversation. He prayed with his team, asked questions, sought counsel. He could be firm, even stubborn, but he always made sure everyone felt like part of the mission. Joni, however, moved differently. Her tone was sharper, her decisions quicker. There was no group discussion anymore, only instructions. One employee later said, "It was like Marcus died, and overnight we had a new CEO." The warmth was gone. What stunned people most wasn't her confidence, it was her timing. Marcus's funeral had barely ended before Joni began reshaping the organization. Positions shifted. Some staff were quietly let go. Projects that Marcus had postponed or rejected suddenly reappeared on the calendar. The messaging of the network began to evolve too. The tone of the broadcasts changed. Fewer sermons about family, more about vision and new seasons. It felt less like a time of grief and more like a time of strategy. Then came the moment everyone started whispering about: the arrival of Dr. Doug Weiss. Many Daystar viewers recognized him as a guest speaker and Christian psychologist who had appeared on the network in the past. At first, his return seemed innocent enough. A familiar face, maybe there to help Joni through her pain, offering counseling and support. But soon, his role became hard to define. He wasn't just a visitor, he was everywhere, sitting in on meetings, consulting on projects, giving advice during broadcasts. People noticed how much Joni leaned on him, how often she quoted him in meetings. Doug thinks. Doug suggested. Doug prayed about this. It started as a whisper of curiosity, then became something no one could ignore. To those working behind the scenes, it felt like Doug had stepped into a space that hadn't even gone cold yet. He wasn't replacing Marcus publicly, but privately, he was already beside Joni, guiding her every move. The changes within Daystar accelerated. Legal documents were processed quickly, titles were updated, ownership and leadership structures that would normally take months to reorganize were finished in record time. Some employees who had been part of Daystar for over a decade found themselves reassigned or suddenly dismissed. Others left voluntarily, saying the ministry no longer felt like the one they had devoted their lives to. Still, no one said anything publicly. The grief narrative was too strong. To the outside world, Joni was still the grieving widow, holding the ministry together. She smiled on camera, spoke of Marcus's legacy, and quoted scripture about faith and perseverance. But, behind closed doors, the organization was being rebuilt from the ground up. Fast, quiet, and without questions. Some people tried to justify it. They said Joni was just being responsible, that Marcus would have wanted her to be decisive. Others couldn't ignore the eerie preparedness of it all. She didn't look lost, one former staff member said. She looked like she already knew what to do, like she had rehearsed this moment in her mind. It wasn't just the pace of the changes, it was the precision. Even the estate details, the legal transitions, the restructuring of Daystar's assets happened with surprising efficiency. Nothing was left undone. Everything was handled. Fast, clean, professional. Too professional, some said. It made people wonder how long these plans had been waiting, quietly in the background. And through it all, Joni never slowed down. She began speaking more often on air, not as Marcus's partner, but as his successor. Her tone was confident, her words commanding. She talked about moving forward, about a fresh start for Daystar. The language of grief was fading. In its place came something new. Language about leadership, purpose, and progress. The staff who remained tried to adapt. They prayed together, hoping things would eventually settle. But the truth was, the atmosphere had changed completely. The laughter that once echoed through the halls was gone. The ministry that had felt like a family now felt like a brand, and Joni was the face of it. Her connection to Doug Weiss continued to grow, both personally and professionally. Before long, people stopped wondering if they were close. They knew. Photos surfaced of them together at events, smiling side by side. Within a year, their relationship became public. To the viewers, it was framed as a story of redemption, a woman finding love again after heartbreak. But to those who had watched the rapid transformation inside Daystar, it raised questions that no one dared to ask out loud. How long had Doug really been in the picture? When had Joni decided to move forward? Was all of this part of a plan that began before Marcus was even gone? No one knows for sure. Joni never addressed those questions directly. She didn't explain the timing or the sudden changes. She didn't talk about how the structure of the ministry had shifted so drastically. She simply kept moving, onward, upward, unbothered. By the time 2022 came to an end, Daystar no longer felt like the same network. It was sleeker, more efficient, but also colder. The sermons, the interviews, the tone, everything felt controlled, polished, managed. The ministry Marcus had built from faith and fire had turned into an empire of order and image. To this day, people who were there remember those early months after Marcus's death, not as a time of mourning, but as a time of transition, from heart to hierarchy, from family to business. Joni didn't just step into her husband's shoes, she built her own, and made sure everyone knew who was wearing them. It was called strength. It was called vision. But to those who watched it unfold in real time, it looked like something else entirely. The moment when grief quietly turned into governance, and the mission Marcus Lamb had once led became the kingdom Joni ruled. By the time a year had passed after Marcus Lamb's death, Daystar didn't look or feel the same. The cameras still rolled, the music still played, and the familiar logo still appeared on screen, but something in the atmosphere had changed. To viewers at home, everything seemed steady. Joni was hosting, smiling, preaching about strength and faith. But to those who had been inside the ministry long enough, it felt like they were watching a completely different network. The warmth that had once filled the halls was gone, replaced by a quiet tension that no one wanted to name. The new Daystar was sharp, polished, efficient. Every segment felt perfectly timed, every word rehearsed. The spontaneity Marcus was known for, the moments when he would laugh too loud, go off script, or pray without warning, had disappeared. In its place stood a version of the ministry that ran like a machine. Staff, who had once felt like family, now acted like employees. Meetings were shorter, decisions were final, and everything revolved around one person, Joni. Her leadership was absolute. She spoke with confidence and authority, often reminding her team that she was simply carrying on Marcus's vision. But in truth, her version of that vision looked very different. There was less talk about community and more about image, less prayer and more production. The message had shifted subtly, from faith to branding, from connection to control. And then there was Doug Weiss. His presence was no longer a secret. What started as whispers had become public knowledge. Joni and Doug appeared together often, their closeness undeniable. To the outside world, it was a love story, a widow finding comfort and purpose again. But behind the scenes, many couldn't shake the feeling that this relationship had begun long before the public ever knew. Some of the old staff were gone by then, a few left quietly, others were pushed out. Those who remained learned to stay silent, to smile when the cameras turned on, to nod in agreement even when they didn't understand the new direction. "It's just different now," one former employee said. "The spirit of it, it's gone. It's all about control." Viewers noticed changes too. Messages poured in asking where Jonathan and Susie Lamb had gone, why longtime hosts were missing, and why Joni never addressed the rumors surrounding her new marriage. But there were no answers. Every question was met with silence or carefully crafted statements about focusing on the mission. Even now, that silence lingers. The diary rumors, the sudden leadership shift, the relationship with Doug. None of it has ever been explained. Joni never confirmed anything, never denied it either. Maybe she doesn't have to. Maybe she believes the best way to protect what's left of Daystar is to keep the past buried. But for many who once called the network home, the questions remain. What really happened in those final months before Marcus's death? How much did he know, and how long had the next chapter already been planned? No one outside Joni's circle knows the answers, and perhaps no one ever will, because the truth about the new Daystar isn't found in what's said on air. It's found in what's missing. The laughter, the unity, the honesty. The network survived, but the soul of it, the part that felt alive, didn't. And that's what hurts the most. The world sees a ministry still shining, but those who remember what it once was can't help but wonder if somewhere along the way the light dimmed and no one was allowed to talk about it.